As Gordon mentioned, I am the Senior Manager, not of the Ontario Climate Consortium, but of the Research and Development Group at the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, although I do, with a number of other staff, Chandra and Harris and Stewart, who many of you may know, work with the Ontario Climate Consortium, which is a group of organizations who have tried to take on the issue of gaps in climate data and information in Ontario, and I'll talk a bit more on that in a second. I should acknowledge Harris Switzman in particular, whose work as part of the Ontario Climate Consortium has allowed us to generate the insights that we're providing today, which is a perspective on climate data and information in Ontario. It's not necessarily definitive, but it's a reflection of our experience in working with a number of different sectors and stakeholders across the province on climate data information in the context of adaptation. The Ontario Climate Consortium is a collaborative of both researchers and users in the public and private sector in Ontario that was basically a grassroots effort to deal with the gap in information and guidance on how to do and conduct climate change adaptation planning and impact assessment in Ontario. And it has three streams of programming: climate information services, impacts and adaptation, practice and guidance, and mobilization of research. And there's more to be found on the website, and I'll come back to the mission of the consortium at the end. What I'm going to talk about today is what is climate change, and what do we need it as or why do we need it as sort of a preamble, but then echoing and building on the really excellent briefing note that's in our agenda package that the Commissioner's Office put together, talking about both what the state of, as we perceive it at least, of climate data and information in Ontario is at present, and what some of the outcomes are of the relatively ad hoc approach or the landscape of climate information that exists in Ontario today. So what is climate information? Why do we need it? It's obviously a much longer story than this, but we need climate information because we plan our societal activities, our economic activities. We design our infrastructure and plan it around what we expect the climate to be, that it needs to that it needs to be responsive to. We need to plan agricultural practices around it. We need to plan buildings and design buildings. We need to design drainage and many more aspects of planning and design that rely on climate information. But what we're talking about today is climate information in the context of climate change adaptation planning, and we need this because the climate that we've experienced in the past, as we all know, I don't think there'd be any debate in this room, is not going to be the climate that we're going to experience in the future. So we need to understand, or at least plan for, different climate and not be able to rely on history repeating itself. And that information, or climate science and the information and data that comes out of it, gets fed into the process of climate adaptation planning and implementation, excuse me, in assessing potential future risks, making plans, and then importantly, verifying, learning, monitoring, and revisiting those decisions over time. In climate adaptation, could simplify it down to sort of two really key aspects of climate information and data that are required. There's the historical data to understand baseline conditions and historic vulnerability and risk, and then there's climate model projections, primarily, is what people are using to look at or to investigate what the potential future climate might be that designing and planning needs to take into account. So this is a definition from a United Nations Environment Program document that Harris pulled out, but I think is a good one. It's not just about the data, although the observed, modeled, and created data series are sort of the heart of it, but it's also the statistics and the analysis of that data that are done, as well as, and importantly, the contextual information that's required to interpret and use climate data. And depending on what aspect or stage of adaptation planning is occurring, there are very different climate information needs as one moves from basic assessment and scoping through to very detailed analysis, the level of complexity effort and in particular uncertainty increases. And this is based on a piece that Uranos has put out recently, a really excellent piece around how users should figure out what climate data they actually need, and it's not a simple process. The purpose of the climate information obviously is key, but also the capabilities of the data to process the information, the specific variables that are of interest, the resolution, and the actual statistics or indices that are required. And the wording of this isn't important, but this is following on that piece from Uranos, just demonstrating the level of and complexity of decision making that needs to take place when users are figuring out what climate data they actually need. So in the state of affairs in Ontario at present, as far as we have experienced it in trying to work with, as I said, a variety of stakeholders, practitioners and sectors in dealing with and helping them with climate change adaptation, right from information through to adaptation planning. In terms of where climate users or climate adaptation practitioners can get climate information in Ontario, from the historic perspective, there are lots of places that data can be obtained. Environment Canada is often the default, but there are all kinds of other monitoring networks that exist, as well as a large number of gridded data sets that have been prepared specifically for the purpose of comparison or baseline analysis when future climate scenarios are concerned. So there's at least 14 different data products on that front. And then on the side of future climate projections, at least as far as we've identified, there are at least 21 different publicly available future climate data sets that contain information relevant to Ontario that are relatively straightforward to at least use and obtain the basic data. Those data sets include various combinations of global climate model output, regional climate model output, and statistically downscaled data based on global or regional climate modeling. And then the more sophisticated or the users that have the ability to pay for it often get analysis done. And analysis could mean anything from very specific climate modeling to analysis of existing climate model output, and that's done by various agencies, universities, and consultants. So there's not really a data availability problem in Ontario. If anything, there's a problem with figuring out where and which data sources you should use and which ones are more definitive or useful than others. This is information from a piece that the OCC is working on and Harris is leading around the state of climate change science in the Great Lakes Basin. So it doesn't necessarily just reflect the state of climate information use and adaptation in Ontario, but it's probably a pretty good cross-section, and you could say that it's likely analogous to the state of things in Ontario. Climate information is primarily being used for work on when it comes to impacts and adaptation, water issues and hydrology and ecological issues, and then further to that on the climatology and climate modeling methods piece, climate data is being used to further the sort of more abstract work that's being done on climate modeling. And then a smattering of work in a broad number of other sectors. And what information are users using? Now this is again from the Great Lakes study, so it doesn't just take Ontario users into account, but again, perhaps and likely a fairly representative indication of where and what climate information users in Ontario are using. This shows the scenarios that most climate information users are using in the Great Lakes Basin, primarily still using the fourth assessment report outputs and most often using the extreme A2 forcing scenario. See the new representative concentration pathways from the fifth assessment report appear to be not widely used as of yet, despite the fact that they've been out for a couple of years. In terms of what models and what modeling centers users are using the data from, obviously certain models are more popular than others. The Hadley and Canadian Global Climate models seem to be the predominant ones, although a number of others are used fairly often. Interestingly and importantly, usually only small ensembles of models are used, so a handful of these models are picked rather than large ensembles looking at the output of a variety of global or regional models, and that's important. I'll come back to that. And then from the perspective of downscaling methods, whether users are actually downscaling information or not, a large number of users are still using raw GCM output without downscaling, and while statistical downscaling is popular as well, it's often relatively unsophisticated, the kind of statistical downscaling that's done. Dynamical downscaling as well appears fairly prevalent here, but that also includes users that are using the stock output from regional climate modeling that's done by modeling centers. And our take on, and we think this is an important question, how users decide what climate information to get and how to use it in Ontario. This is qualitative at best, sort of based on our anecdotal information and our experience, but it appears that word of mouth, sort of informal networks and communities of practice that sort of have developed between users that are in proximity or in the same sector, and convenience and familiarity with local researchers and those who are doing and producing and analyzing climate data in one's, say, local area or sector. Uranos and IPCC information is often accessed, which is certainly a good thing, although, and this is no criticism of the work that's done by those organizations, but it doesn't reflect, nor is it their information designed specifically for the Ontario context. So what are the outcomes? And again, this is only our perspective, but what's our perspective on the outcomes of this relatively ad hoc approach to obtaining and using climate information in Ontario as it stands right now? Well, one thing and a challenge is that uncertainty in many ways is not being dealt with. Coming back to the information about many users only using very small ensembles of climate information or climate models, not capturing the degree of uncertainty and spread that those models, when looked at in aggregate, produce. So this is a graphic that shows on the left the various types of uncertainty associated with simply projections of total sort of mean global temperature increase when looking at all the models. Is the uncertainty with just the internal variability of individual global climate models, but then there's the spread associated with the use of different models and different modeling centers, and then when you bump up the various emissions or concentration pathway scenarios, you get a huge range of potential outcomes. And this is just temperature. This is what global climate models are best at when you start looking at precipitation and wind and other things like that. Uncertainty it goes up by orders of magnitude in some case. And on the right, it's just a graphic that shows that basically the proportion of uncertainty to the signal that the global climate models are producing. So what this means, especially as you move out, as the ratio becomes closer to 1-to-1, the uncertainty is as great as the message, I guess, that the global climate models are producing. So say you're getting the mean projection or the mean indication from models is that global temperatures are going to go up by 50%. Well, that means you've got a plus or minus 50% margin of error or degree of uncertainty associated with that prediction, which is obviously huge. This is another graphic showing that cascade of uncertainty, looking at not just the different models, but also the different concentration pathways and sort of future global emission scenarios from a precipitation perspective. Again, a huge scatter, minus 25 to plus 40% on sort of a global average. We also see scale mismatches in terms of what users are interested in and what they need to know versus the information that they're obtaining and the scale at which it's developed. This graphic shows the scale on the left of different types of sort of weather phenomena and for example, thunderstorm cells and sort of intense rainfall caused by convective processes are really one of the most predominant, I guess, aspects of future climate that is being talked about in Ontario, given the events we've experienced recently and the damages that have occurred with them in Toronto, Burlington, and elsewhere. Just contrasted with the scale of grids from global circulation models or global climate models. Toronto is only a speck in the output of one particular cell, or is only a speck in one particular cell where a global climate model produces output. That cell also includes Kingston and Pittsburgh, so clearly not producing information that's specific to the processes that cause our weather in Toronto, which we know are very different from, for example, those particular cities. And there's the issue of inconsistency that results from looking at things in different ways or not looking at the entire range of potential future outcomes and climate information. This is a graphic from some work that we're working on with the University of McMaster and University of Waterloo on the results of using different ways of looking at future IDF curves or predicting future IDF curves. We've got the observed existing curve for 2-hour storms down on the bottom here. Moving up, these are only four of a possible dozens or even hundreds of scenarios that could be examined of different climate models and methods for analyzing them to produce future IDF curves. And you have a huge spread in outcomes. If you were to use, say, this particular scenario, you would anticipate say 10%, 10 to 15% increase in your 100-year 2-hour storm. If you were going to, however, look at this scenario, you'd be looking at over 100% increase. So there are challenges associated with the fact that different users are picking different scenarios, using different techniques, and often coming up with very different results. And then there's the issue of inaction. Despite all the attention and the discussion that's happening on the costs of inaction and failing to prepare for climate change, the lack of climate data, uniformity or the convergence of particular guidance or the emergence of a definitive data center or guidance piece on how to use it has resulted in a lot of users, especially those smaller, less, for lack of a better word, wealthy users that can't afford to dig in, hire consultants, sponsor research. They've chosen not to move forward in some cases on climate change adaptation because they feel that they need more specific information and more precise information. So ironically, that attention on climate data is causing many users not to proceed, and what's often forgotten is that it's not just climate data that's needed in order to conduct good adaptation planning. And uncertainty, even if we deal with it on the climate information side of things, which we probably never will, but even if we get a handle on it and are able to deal with and account for the uncertainty of climate information and adaptation planning, that only sort of deals with the top of the pyramid when it comes to uncertainty in climate change adaptation. There's an equal or even greater amount of uncertainty associated with the prediction of impacts associated with particular climate changes on different systems, whether they be natural, social, or infrastructure. And then there's the uncertainty around the success of and the potential success of adaptation responses. So what a lot of folks are talking about, and a lot of the sort of proactive folks in Ontario who are doing really good work, the City of Toronto and the Region of Peel, as only two examples, are saying, we don't need the world's best or most precise climate information in order to be able to do adaptation planning. We can move forward in many ways without needing to wait for climate data. So just to sum up, again, our perspective on the situation and the landscape of climate data and information availability and use in particular in Ontario, it's our feeling that the availability of climate data and information is not a problem. If anything, there's perhaps too much data. Ontario users need help with the application of that data, the defensible application of that in adaptation planning. What data do they need? What data sets should they extract it from? How should they use it appropriately? And very importantly, what shouldn't be attempted with the data that is out there in the public domain for them to use, but that could potentially be misused with many pitfalls. The climate data and information environment in Ontario is ad hoc in many ways and is leading to, despite the fact that there's much excellent work being done, but it is being done in nodes that aren't always connected to one another, and with different levels of access to information and expertise. So this is leading to, as I mentioned earlier, inconsistent methods of analysis, results that can't be compared on an apples-to-apples basis. Often, not always, but often an insufficient reflection on issues of climate data uncertainty and appropriate scale. And ultimately, and again, this is not a criticism of anybody's work, because there's a lot of great work going on. But in instances where those first two conditions are present, it could, for obvious reasons, lead to inefficient use of resources in climate adaptation planning and in implementation, and potentially ineffective climate change adaptation measures. And as I mentioned as well, for many folks, this is leading to inaction. And finally, as I was alluding to, an exclusive focus on climate data and information as the sort of source of the problem for why adaptation planning isn't more uniform, more universal, more mainstream in Ontario, we think can be counterproductive, because it's not just about climate data. Good adaptation planning in many ways can happen in the absence of climate information, or with only very basic climate information. And we're never going to be able to get precise information about what the future climate is going to look like. There's always going to be massive uncertainty. So as I'm sure we'll hear about from some of the speakers coming up, many users and the advanced users feel that good adaptation planning isn't about designing to a precise future condition. It's about adaptive and resilient and flexible solutions. And any effort, and therefore, I guess, any effort to improve the climate information situation in Ontario can't focus only on climate data and information, but it also needs to address the quality and the consistency of adaptation planning right from analysis through to implementation. And coming back to the Ontario Climate Consortium, the group that the Toronto Region Conservation Authority and York University have started, that now includes and involves 12 universities across the province, a number of provincial and federal agencies, and private industry representatives as well. Those issues that we've talked about are what the consortium was set up to try and tackle. They've been around for quite some time, and as I said, this has been kind of a grassroots effort to tackle some of those, and there's been some really excellent work done. There's some sectors and users out there that really want to do great work, and we've had the chance to do, and what we feel is quality use of climate information in analysis and adaptation planning with them, but we've still only managed to connect with and contact a relatively small number of the folks that actually need this kind of support and guidance to be able to move the bar forward on adaptation in Ontario. we're really happy that the Environmental Commissioner's Office, the Environmental Commissioner's Office has picked up on this, and we, and I'm sure as many other folks in this room who have also tried to move the bar forward in Ontario would agree, we could really use some attention, some focus, some resources at the provincial scale in order to be able to move forward on this. And we look forward to being part of the conversation over the rest of the day. Thank you.